Story 1. I worked at McDonald's in high school. We had a kid take the cash drawer, jump the counter, and run on his first day. The dumbass had fully filled out all his paperwork and everything with his real name and address, though. Story 2. New driver and guard at an armored car company. Back from her first route, the person checking her in asked where a missing bag of money was. She was hiding it in her jacket. It was only $1,200. Story 3. Got caught using the trainer's identification badge to access a printer to make copies of a prescription pad he stole from a doctor. He wanted to hook people up at his new office. This happened on day 3 of training, and everyone was already concerned by his unhinged comments and behavior leading up to this. So it didn't really surprise anyone. Story 4. Isolated mine in Western Australia where you need to fly in to get to work. A newcomer on their first day complains about a toothache. Our on-site medical team doesn't provide dental care, so they offered to fly him back to Perth to see a dentist. He accepts and then goes radio silent. There is no response to calls, texts, or emails. After a couple of weeks, it's assumed that he has abandoned his employment, and he is formally terminated. A few months later, a supervisor receives an email from him apologizing and explaining that he had to serve some time in prison. He asks if he can return to work. Story 5. One of my first jobs was at an amusement park. On the first day, we had a meet and greet to break the ice and get to know who we would be working with for the season. Our team lead had walked off to grab some paperwork, so we had an opportunity for some more candid chit-chat. Pretty much immediately after she left, one of my coworkers bragged about using his brother's urine to pass the drug test. The next day, he was gone. The surprising part is none of us reported him. He did it to himself. It turns out he was so proud of his feat that he also bragged about it on Facebook, shortly after he had accepted a friend request from one of the park's social media accounts. He must have been high all the time to not realize how foolish that idea was. Story 6. An intern on his first day decided to open the door of a room where a few of the seniors were having an important meeting. He briefly lifted his leg up, farted, and walked away laughing. He got fired on the spot. Story 7. Technically, he had been with the company for a while, but he was fired within a week of working in our office. The chap was a bit eccentric. He wore what I could only describe as English country gentleman attire for work and smoked a pipe. He had been sent to our office to hot desk for whatever reason. As the week went on, he seemed to be getting more and more tense until Thursday, when in the afternoon, security came in and escorted him out of our office while the big manager apologized for the disruption. We then saw him get arrested outside, bundled into a police car, and driven away. It turns out he was selling handguns and weapons illegally using his work email account. According to the security guard I chatted with, they had been on to him for a while. Story 8. Started training a new waitress who got into a screaming match with a customer over how to pronounce quinoa. She lasted exactly 37 minutes. The manager just pointed to the door without saying a word. Story 9. Worked at a rental car company in the winter. On his first day, the brand new detailer refused to clean snow off cars. He was fired within 15 minutes of showing up. Story 10. Watched our new receptionist get walked out after 2 hours because she wouldn't stop eating during client meetings. Not like a quiet snack, but full-on crunchy chips and slurping smoothies while people were trying to talk. Her defense was, "I'm a foodie," when human resources stepped in. Story 11. I work in information technology. At my last job, this older guy, around 50 to 60 years old, lied on his resume and in his interview an insane amount. He ended up getting the job he applied for in the finance department. We got his gear set up at his desk, and I met him when he arrived on his first day. It was very apparent to us that he knew absolutely nothing about using computers. He couldn't open Outlook, use Excel, or any of the Office suite at all, and seemed completely lost in front of his computer. His new manager soon came to this realization as well, and he was let go before 12 o'clock on his first day. Fastest turnaround I have ever seen in my whole career. Story 12. Worked at a strip club and a girl came in to audition and did great. She came back the next day for her first shift. She brought her boyfriend, although nobody knew it was her boyfriend, who tried to fight the first guy who put money in her thong during her first song before she even took anything off. She made it about 3 minutes into her first shift. Story 13. New nurse didn't feel like being transferred to another area to work after 2 people called out. She started yelling at the nurse manager. However, the nurse manager's regional manager was also visiting that day, so she went over to the shouting nurse and said, "Your manager asked you to please go work in Building 3 today. Please pack up your things and go to Building 3 for the day." New nurse. Who are you? Get out of my face. She was fired by the regional nurse manager and escorted out by security 20 minutes later. Story 14. New barman started work at 11 a.m., helped himself to drinks behind the bar, called a regular a derogatory term, told people the food was not great, flirted with the manager's wife, caught ringing up half pints instead of full pints and pocketing the difference. Left at 12:30 p.m. Story 15. 3 weeks. Which you may be thinking isn't fast, but as a doctor, it is like lightning. We had a new doctor in the emergency department who was hired during COVID-19 to fill some of the rota gaps, and he seemed friendly enough. He was put on his first week of nights and didn't see a single patient. He just disappeared into the rest of the hospital. He was caught asking a first-year resident how to read a hip x-ray that was clearly fractured. He had to have all his patients reevaluated because his work was being brought under review. It was an absolute nightmare. Hiring standards during COVID-19 got pretty loose because we were extremely stretched, but that sure was something. I've never seen a doctor show up and disappear that fast. As an aside, a doctor hired alongside him was openly less experienced than the level of seniority he was hired at, was open about it, was dropped down to the appropriate level to train at, and everyone appreciated that the guy knew his limits. Story 16. Mail on Friday from the boss. Let's welcome Mary back on Monday from her maternity leave. Monday 8:10 a.m. Mary, crying, saying goodbye to everybody. She was laid off by the same boss just as she came into the office. Story 17. I work in information technology, and we had a new employee starting on our customer service team. I met with all new employees to do their information technology onboarding. So we are walking through getting signed into everything when one of my female colleagues came into my office to get a mouse. The new guy stands up and tells her he has a mouse for her and motions to his crotch. I immediately sent my human resources a message and they came with security and escorted him out. He was there maybe 25 minutes. Story 18. My husband got a friend of his an interview where he was working. The friend's interview went great and he got hired. He was excited and did a donut in their big gravel parking lot. They called him right after and told him that was unacceptable and not to bother coming in. Story 19. This is the opposite of what usually happens, but I thought it was pretty funny. My boss was away on business and I managed a tea shop near a Starbucks years ago. This kid came in. He was from abroad and said he was supposed to start today. We were hiring and I trained him. My boss came back 2 days later and had no idea. The kid was in the wrong place, but he stayed with us. He was hired on the spot without even applying. Story 20. I worked in a bar and casual restaurant, and we had to let a guy go on his first shift. He decided it was a good idea to drink all the leftovers from the glasses that came back to the bar before washing them. Story 21. A 20-year-old guy got hired to work at the seafood counter. Saw him twice and then never again. Asked a coworker what happened. He had closed the seafood section one night and was walking out of the store when the 6 pounds of crab legs he'd stuffed down the back of his pants fell out in front of the closing manager. Story 22. He crashed the company car while reversing it out of the garage and lied about it. It was a small dent, and the incident was caught on camera. I asked him if he wanted to change his statement. He accused me of calling him a liar. It was his second day on the job. The hardest part about that was his wife was friends with my then-girlfriend, and he started telling everyone that I had it out for him. Don't do favors for friends, I guess. Story 23. About 5 days. I was working in groundskeeping for a cemetery and memorial garden, and the owner hired his nephew's company to lay polyvinyl chloride pipe to extend a water hookup 200 yards to a new hand pump. It was not a hard job. The pump was literally straight downhill. Dig, grade, lay. He did the work. then told the boss there wasn't enough water pressure from the water company to execute the job. The owner fired his nephew, but, incongruously, didn't ask for his money, a couple of $1,000, back. We, two workers making $10 an hour, dug it up, and he had somehow graded it almost 10 degrees uphill. You could eyeball it and see it was slanted. Story 24. Regular at my bar came in and ordered his regular beer and a shot. Served him 3 rounds over about an hour and a half. Then my business partner's wife came in and said, "All right, get ready to start your training." He had been hired as a bartender without my knowing. Started his first shift 6 deep. I didn't even rat on him. He made it about 10 minutes before she asked why he smelled like Evan Williams. He then dropped a beer into the ice well on his first pour. I'd say 10 minutes is one of the fastest. Story 25. Had a new guy in the maintenance department turn up for work, and a couple of hours in, he was sent over to the music department in a huge private school to fix some minor issues. He opened the fridge and found a few bottles of wine left over from after a performance and drank them. He passed out on the floor, and when one of the women teachers came in and found him, she freaked out and screamed because she thought he had died on the job. He woke up, screamed, ran out, and went home. He got fired by phone later that day. Story 26. We had a chef turn up for a trial week and was put on desserts. The first night, he drank a whole bottle of Malibu that was meant for the fruit cocktail and got sent home for being too drunk. The following morning, he turned up early, ready for work, and had no memory of being fired the night before. Story 27. We had a morning toolbox talk to introduce the new guy. The boss made an announcement, introduced them, said what they would be doing, and asked the new guy to say a few words. He gets up, and the first words out of this guy's mouth are "Morning, everyone." The boss interjected and said, "You know what? Don't bother," and told the guy to leave immediately. We all just sat there like stunned mullets. Story 28. I work for a towboat company that pushes barges. They hired a deckhand whom we picked up at our dock. It was my job to train him, so we got him on the boat, got his gear squared away, and gave him a tour of the boat. After signing off on his initial paperwork, we fire up and depart to go to the fleet where the barges are kept. As we make the turn into the cut where our fleet is, the boat leans a little and water splashes up on the deck. This sends him into a panic, and he is in the galley sitting in the corner crying, screaming to get him off of here. So we go to the back of the fleet and call the office, and they send someone over in a truck, and he gets off the boat. He lasted all of about 45 minutes from the time he stepped on board until he got off. It turns out he was scared of water and thought it would be okay since the boats are big and stable. Story 29. I work in a call center and have been there for several years. As management, we would go and introduce ourselves to new hire classes on the second or third day, and there was always at least one person who had to be the loudmouth. After we introduced ourselves, the department manager asked the trainer what they were covering that day, and the trainer said they were discussing difficult customers. Mr. Loudmouth spoke up and said, "If someone starts being a jerk with me, I'll just tell them I know where they live and will pay them a visit. I have a trunk full of guns that will make them start being nice." One of the other new hires said kind of sheepishly, "He really does." We all kind of made light of it, but after we left the classroom, our manager said we needed to do something about it. She emailed the trainer who had the person in the class who said the guy did have guns come to her office. After some questions, it turned out that Mr. Loudmouth did actually have several guns in his trunk and was proudly talking about them as well as showing them to some of the classmates. Our manager called the local police department, who made him open his trunk. He had several rifles and handguns in his trunk and was immediately fired for bringing firearms onto company property and threatening to use customer information to cause harm. Story 30. About 2 hours in, a new hire for our window washing company straight up ran away. A young Asian guy, maybe about 20 years old, seemed eager to work but severely underestimated how physically demanding it is to be a window washer. That day, we were a crew of 6 guys doing a fairly nice home in Beverly Hills with large windows. After about 90 minutes, the young man asked how much longer we'd be working. I let him know it would be about 5 more hours. He said he was going to the work van to get his drink. I looked back over my shoulder. and he just took off in a full sprint down the street and never came back. At $20 an hour, though, I don't even blame him. Truth be told, that was some hard work. But we did it because we were all being paid cash under the table, and most of the people working for that company weren't legal anyway. Story 31. Cabinet maker here. My boss took on a tradesman when I was still an apprentice. This guy had been stuck in a factory his whole career and didn't know how to install a cabinet properly. So I had to tell him how to do that. He once disappeared for an hour and a half for lunch when we only had half-hour lunch breaks. He was also an alcoholic, and I would constantly catch him drinking on the job. He wouldn't show up for work, even with us showing up to his door at 7:30 a.m. to pick him up on the way to the site. He was getting a sweet deal too. The last employers he had weren't paying him properly and clearly didn't teach him anything. With my boss, I was running things as a second-year apprentice. He could have learned so much, and he would have been paid fairly, but his personal life caught up with him, and he couldn't handle it. He lasted like 3 weeks with us before my boss fired him. He was so out of it, he left half his tools behind and hasn't come back to collect them. I hope he cleaned himself up and got back on his feet because he was a cool dude otherwise.